But let's begin, Dr. Pailey, by you telling us a little bit about yourself. I like the fact that you describe yourself as an academic activist. There are many of them out there, but not many of them embrace the label like you do. And go ahead from that and then tell us as much as you can about yourself, Dr. Pailey.
Sure. And Octavius, I'm going to insist that you just call me Robtel, because one of the things I'll say in terms of who I am is I consider myself to be a pretty humble person. So titles don't I'm not enamored by titles. I think titles are just an extension of who we are, but they're not the whole person, the essence of who we are. So my name is Robtel Neajai Pailey, and I am a Liberian academic, activist, and author. And I prefer the title scholar activist because everything that I do in terms of my scholarship is informed by a very deep, abiding commitment to social justice, to equity, to uncovering what Arundhati Roy, the Indian author and activist, says, the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. So she argues that there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. So I'm very interested in uncovering, excavating the voices of people who have been marginalized, subjugated by structural violence. Structural violence basically means any sort of norms, rules, and regulations that fuel inequality and injustice. So I would say that's what informs my scholarship. I am an assistant professor based at the London School of Economics and Political Science in London, so that's where my base is. But I frequent Liberia, so I go back and forth between London and Monrovia, because in many ways, Liberia is not my second home, but my first home.
And so naturally, the question of citizenship arises as an academic. How did you become interested in the topic or the concept of citizenship to the point of doing serious academic research on the topic?
Well, I've always been interested in citizenship, and I think of citizenship as more than just the being, right? And this comes out quite extensively throughout my book. I'm interested in the doing. So citizenship for me is very much marked by what you do with that nationality or what you do with that identity. That's what makes you a citizen. I was born in Liberia. I left there when I was 6, long before the war started, to join my parents in Washington, D.C. And I pretty much lived as an undocumented migrant for over 14 years. So I came to the States, as is the case with a lot of undocumented migrants, on a visitor visa, and then I overstayed. And for a number of years, my parents tried to regularize my status. My mom eventually naturalized as a U.S. citizen in order to enable me to get permanent residency in the United States. And so for those 14 years of what I call undocumented limbo, I've always been interested in what does it mean to be a citizen of a country that you don't live in? What does it mean to be a citizen from afar? And that eventually translated into doing more research on dual citizenship. So I worked in Liberia for 4 years between 2007 and 2011 for the government of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I worked directly in her office as her special assistant for communications. And one of the things I was in charge of, or tasked with the responsibility of overseeing, was diaspora engagement, because I had completed an MSc degree in African Studies, African History and Politics at Oxford University immediately before moving to Liberia to work for the government. And in the process of gaining knowledge, but then also policy, a sort of policy understanding of the contours of diaspora engagement, I started interviewing and liaising with a lot of Liberians outside of Liberia. And I started doing this even before moving to Liberia because it was a topic of my research. I was particularly interested in the process of return migration, post-war return migration. So I started talking to Liberians in the UK, and Liberians in the United States, Liberians in Australia, Liberians in other parts of Africa. And what I kept hearing over and over, Octavius, was, okay, so the government wants to harness our political, economic, and social resources, but many of us have naturalized abroad, and the law says that we have effectively relinquished our Liberian citizenship by virtue of having naturalized. So how can the government make these kinds of demands on us to be engaged in social socioeconomic transformation, and they have effectively revoked our citizenship. That's a tall ask. So I was particularly intrigued by this idea of transnational citizenship, a citizenship that's been revoked because of a legal kind of technicality. So that's what I would say, that's where the seed of my current book project, but then also my PhD research was planted, is this sort of engaging with Liberians, particularly those who lived abroad, but had naturalized and still had this very deep, abiding loyalty, this deep, abiding faith, or even commitment to Liberia, even though legally they weren't considered citizens by the nation state.
And so the seed that was planted led to this book, Development, Dual Citizenship, and its Discontents in Africa. The book is available now on Amazon, The Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia. So let's come to the book specifically. The first thing that caught my eye, Robtel, is that you explain the concept of citizenship as a triad. And I've always thought about it as being flat, more or less. Explain that a little bit for our audience.
Sure. So before I do that, I'm going to make a plug for my publisher, Cambridge University Press. So I would actually encourage people to go on the Cambridge University Press website rather than Amazon to purchase the book, just because I think Amazon has too much of a monopoly in the book, the book sourcing world. And then the other thing is I'm going to make a plug for Chase Walker, who is a Liberian visual artist. He's self-taught. He's also illustrated two of my children's books that I've published previously, but he is the one who illustrated the cover of that book. And maybe if you hold it up, Octavius, our readers or our listeners can see this beautiful representation of what I conceive as a political economy of belonging. So Chase Walker, thank you so much for your collaboration. It's been a pleasure working with you. And then of course, Cambridge University Press, my publisher, which is also the top publisher, academic press in the world. So yes, the triad, it's a very long-winded way of getting to your question. So the triad, I interviewed 200 Liberians across the globe for this book. Liberians in Monrovia, obviously the capital of the country. I interviewed Liberians in London. I also interviewed Liberians in Washington, D.C., where I grew up. And then Liberians in the sub-region, in the West African sub-region, so Accra, Ghana, and then also Freetown, Sierra Leone. And after interviewing all these Liberians, both policymakers and non-policymakers, I realized that Liberians effectively conceive of citizenship as a triangle, right? And in that triangle, there are three nodes. So the first node of the triangle is citizenship as passive identity. And this is effectively citizenship that doesn't require very much from you at all. You gain citizenship is conferred on you by virtue of having been born in a country. So jus soli citizenship, birthright citizenship, but then also citizenship by ancestry. So jus sanguinis citizenship by virtue of having a parent or a grandparent who was from the nation state of Liberia. And this effectively is about fulfilling or demanding rights, right? So I think of that part of the triad as about rights. But then there's another part of the triad in which Liberians talked about the fact that citizenship is about contributions. So it's an active, practice-based form of citizenship that requires doing. Remember I said earlier that I don't think of citizenship as just being, I think of citizenship as just doing. And in interviewing these 200 Liberians, I realized that they also thought of citizenship as doing. So doing, what does that mean? It means paying your taxes, whether it's property taxes or income taxes. It means abiding by the laws of the nation state and not flouting the laws, which I think a lot of Liberians do, both in the country as well as abroad. And then also building Liberian capacities. You know, what do you do for your fellow citizen? How do you contribute to your fellow citizens' well-being and economic well-being, social well-being, political well-being? That's what makes you a citizen. The third part of the triad is citizenship as a sort of interactive interaction, right? Relationships. And that's how you interact with your fellow citizen, but also how you interact with the nation state of Liberia. So if you think about this triad, the passive identity-based form of citizenship is about demanding rights. The active practice-based form of citizenship is about fulfilling responsibilities. And the interactive relational form of citizenship is about maintaining or cultivating relationships. So that's the Liberian citizenship triad. And what I argue throughout the book is that although this triad was formulated based on these interviews that I did with Liberians in these 5 different cities, 5 different countries, it is a model that can actually be used for citizenship across the world, right? So it's a broad-based enough model that we can talk about the Rwandan citizenship triad. We can talk about the Belarusian citizenship triad. We can talk about the United States citizenship triad using this model that comes from extensive empirical research that I conducted on and about Liberia.
So if we look at the history of Liberia, naturally, like most other countries, people have come into the country and people have left, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes due to extenuating circumstances like war, crisis, and all of that. So, and migration in general, does this pose a challenge to our legal definition or concept of citizenship?
I think it definitely poses a challenge to the legal definition of citizenship. And you'll notice, having read my book, that I take on a sociological definition of citizenship. So I understand that citizenship is based on legal status, but what I argue throughout the book is that citizenship is more than legal status, right? So it's how people embody citizenship. It's how people practice citizenship. It's how people conceptualize citizenship. That's what's important in thinking about citizenship, not just the legal status. Although the legal status, I would argue, is the foundation of thinking about and conceptualizing citizenship. I think migratory patterns definitely pose a challenge to the legal foundation of citizenship in Liberia, but also across Africa writ large and even across the globe. So one of the things that I do in the book is I talk about this whole idea of being rooted or being rootless, right? So the irony is that while mid-19th century Liberian citizenship was largely based on accepting those who had come from abroad, it was biased against what I call the rooted indigent, right? So for the first century of Liberia's existence, citizenship was not conferred on those who were already in the country. You know, the 16 ethno-linguistic groups that already occupied the hinterland, but then also the coast, were not allowed to have citizenship for the first century of Liberia's existence, which is ironic, right? Because it privileged those rootless immigrants. On the other hand, in the 21st century, as we experience now, Liberia is considered a country of relative emigration. So there are more people leaving the country than entering and settling. But citizenship laws are biased against what I call the rootless emigrant, EMI. So those Liberians who left before, during, or after the war, those Liberians who were born abroad before, during, or after the war are barred from obtaining citizenship. So particularly those Liberians who were born in Liberia and had citizenship conferred on them by birth, who naturalized, who then left the country and naturalized abroad, citizenship is biased against them. And then furthermore, citizenship is biased against those Liberians born abroad who opted to maintain their citizenship by birth, their jus soli citizenship, because the Liberian law is actually quite interesting. There's a bit of a caveat. In some respects, Liberia accepts de facto conditional dual citizenship for Liberians born abroad to Liberian citizen parents. But they have to declare an oath of allegiance to Liberia, and they have to decide on whether they want to maintain their Liberian citizenship by birth. Their foreign citizenship by birth or their Liberian citizenship by ancestry. So the legal parameters around citizenship actually discriminate against a large majority of the population of Liberians who live abroad, those who've naturalized or those who born abroad but have opted to maintain their jus soli, their birthplace citizenship. In the same way that citizenship at Liberia's existence or founding in 1847 was biased against a large majority of those who already lived in the country, who were already there before the settlers arrived. So if you just look at citizenship from the legal parameters, you realize that Liberian citizenship has always been discriminatory. Liberian citizenship has always subjugated a large majority of people in 1847 in 2022. And Liberian citizenship has always been contested because of that bias against the rooted indigent in 1847 up until probably 1947, and the rootless immigrant in the 21st century. So migration, you're right. Migration, and I say this in the book, migration does pose a challenge to the legal definition of citizenship. That's why I think we need to think about citizenship beyond just the legal.
Okay. So I know you mentioned briefly something about Rwandan citizenship earlier, but let's go beyond Liberia and look at the continent as a whole. Is citizenship in Liberia, with all its contentiousness, is it a microcosm? Is it an example of how citizenship is across the continent? Or what were some of the interesting examples you came across in your study?
Sure. I think in many respects, Liberian citizenship is a microcosm of citizenship construction in the continent of Africa. So I'll give an example of the fact that most countries in the continent borrowed their citizenship legal architecture from countries that they had been colonized by, right? So, for instance, so-called Francophone speaking West Africa citizenship laws very much look like French citizenship laws. Now, of course, that's changed post-independence, and even in the 21st century, it looks slightly different. But in terms of how it was modeled, now, although Liberia was not formally colonized by European powers, there were skirmishes between the British and the French when they were trying to carve out territory after the Berlin Conference of 1890 something. Although Liberia did not experience that kind of colonial rupture, the fact of the matter is we did borrow much of our citizenship architecture, our legal citizenship architecture, from the United States, given the relationship between Liberia and the United States. So you find that citizenship laws across the continent, scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani and even Bronwyn Manby, whose work I draw heavily from in the book, have argued that African citizenship laws are very much a colonial artifact, although they have slightly changed in the same way that Liberian citizenship laws might be considered a colonial artifact. However, I think what differentiates Liberia in some respects is that it wasn't colonized, first of all, but Liberia has maintained something called the Negro Clause. So the Negro Clause effectively states that, and this is the topic of my new book, Africa's Negro Republics, and we can talk about that if you think it's of interest to your listeners. The Negro Clause effectively states that people of non-African, non-Black descent cannot obtain citizenship in Liberia, whether by birth or by naturalization. And this is largely a result of, again, those migratory patterns. But the fact of the matter is, the settlers who came from the Caribbean, the Congo River Basin, the United States, had experienced gross racial injustice, economic servitude, and at the hands of white people, right, effectively. So they wanted to carve out a territory in which they would be the sole owners of the means of production. They would control the economy, and they would not experience the same kind of subjugation that they'd experienced in the Caribbean, in the United States, or even as a result of leaving the Congo River Basin. So we can understand that historically why we have this Negro Clause. But the question now is, whose interests does it serve in the 21st century? Could it be considered still protectionist in the way that it was conceived in the 19th century? Or, given that everybody's talking about racism, in the 21st century, could we say that that clause is racist? Now, Liberia is not the only country that has the Negro Clause. Sierra Leone also has a Negro Clause that I would argue, and I do argue throughout my research now, was modeled after Liberia's Negro Clause. The difference with Sierra Leone, however, is that they enable, based on their 2006 dual citizenship bill, they enable non-Black, people of non-African descent to naturalize, even if they were born in the country. So in some respects, this Negro Clause makes Liberia quite unique and peculiar if you compare it to other countries across the continent. But Sierra Leone does have a similar kind of legal architecture around whether, accepting non-Black people, people of non-African descent into the citizenship system. So that's what makes Liberia unique and different.
And I know you said you cover the topic in a little bit more detail in your upcoming book, but the thought that came to my mind as you were speaking is that, and I know that has been referred to as a sort of a racist clause in the past, but if you look at the emergence of racism in Europe, Le Pen in France, the skinhead movement in Germany, Donald Trump here in the United States. There are those who are now arguing that Black people need a secure homeland of their own. What's your thought on this?
I think it's a legitimate argument. And people often ask me whether I believe the Negro Clause is racist or protectionist. I think in many respects, I am wary about calling it a racist clause, simply because if you look at racism, for me, is about power, right? And the differentials of power. If you look at the economic power, the economic might, and sort of the economic clout or influence of non-Black South Asians in, for instance, Liberia, it supersedes the economic power and clout and influence of Black people, Black migrants who've come from other parts of West Africa, and even Black Liberians themselves. So if non-Black, non-African, migrants have more economic power in Liberia than Liberians do, then can we say the clause is racist? Because for me, if there's no power differential, there is a power differential between the majority and the minority around economic might and power and influence, then can we say, so I'm interrogating this idea of the racism of the Negro Clause in the book and in my research. And even in interviews that I had with Liberians in Liberia, many of them question that notion of the clause being racist as well. But again, the research is not completed. So this is a sort of hypothesis that in many respects, the clause is more protectionist than it is racist. But even looking at the protectionism of the clause, my hypothesis is that it only protects the interests of a very small elite minority of Liberians who have a lot of land. So they're the ones who really, really are concerned about removing the clause, because then it means they lose their land, their power over non-Black and non-African people in the country.
Okay, I don't want to pursue that too long, because I was going to go to compare the power of the whites against the power of the small minority, but let's leave that. That's another argument for another day.
Yeah, I mean, you can even look at you think about a Black majority in South Africa. This is something that people keep referring to when I'm interviewing them. The Black majority in South Africa, even after 1994, during the process of democratization in the country, the fact of the matter is the Black majority in South Africa still is very economically depressed, and there's so much racial inequity in the country, even with the ANC leading politically. So you can draw a lot of parallels to other parts of the continent of Africa as well. But again, the research is not complete. So I'll say these are hypotheses that I have, and maybe we can have a conversation in the next year or two when the book is a bit more advanced in terms of the writing.
And I'll be glad to. Let me draw a question from the title of the book. The title is Development, Dual Citizenship, and its Discontents in Africa. Direct question. Does or will dual citizenship lead to development?
It's a good question that I can't answer at the moment. And the reason I say that is I think quite often there's a lot of conjecture in Liberian public discourse, especially amongst those who are staunchly so in support of dual citizenship. So there's a lot of conjecture in the public discourse, but then even a lot of conjecture in some of the scholarly literature that I've read. But most of the literature that I've read, especially amongst dual citizenship scholars, but then also development scholars, is that there is no empirical evidence that demonstrates there's a correlation between enacting dual citizenship and maybe increased economic contributions by those who live abroad. And I subscribe to that because I haven't come across a compelling enough research or arguments or evidence to demonstrate that. I mean, some scholars have said there's an association between enacting dual citizenship and increased economic contributions by those abroad, but they have not been able to prove an actual empirical correlation. So I have to put on my scholarly hat, Octavius, and say, I think that's a very spurious argument to make, that dual citizenship definitely leads to development or socioeconomic transformation. I can't to say definitively if that's the case, because I haven't been presented with compelling enough evidence to demonstrate that that's true. Yeah.
Evidence. Okay. Okay. So the other side of the coin. Let's look at the other side of the coin. The recent past, we've had Liberians who were in the United States who came to Liberia and got jobs under the administration of Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf,
and even have jobs because of George Weah as well. There's some Liberians from abroad in Weah's administration.
But the performance in terms of theft and graft and corruption is there.
It is, and I talk about this in my book. What's interesting is that many Liberians abroad, like me, who came back to work for the government, often argue that the number of people from abroad, so the returnees, whether they had other passports or not, the number of those who were implicated in corruption cases is actually dwarfed by the number of people who were not returnees, who were implicated in corruption cases as well. So because the dual citizenship debate is so widely contested and there's such a gridlock on proposed legislation in that respect, and there's such a huge contestation amongst those who live in the country and those who come from abroad or are abroad, that quite often our tendency is to put those who come from abroad or returnees under a microscope. And the fact of the matter is that they're not the only ones stealing. Liberians who live in the country, steal from the public coffers as well. So I think in the book, I actually document, and I say what I argue is that this is one of the reasons why there's been so much pushback against dual citizenship, is because the assumption is that there's been so much corrupt forms of post-war profiteering by those who've come from abroad. And you can even think about cases like Ellen Corcoran. You can think about cases, and I'll say these are alleged cases because many of them were not actually prosecuted in a court of law. And many of these people were not found guilty. Matilda Parker at the port. The list goes on and on. And Albert Robtel at the LTA. The list goes on and on and on and on of these graft cases. Some of which have been proven, but many of which have not been proven. In which case, people have just packed their bags and gone back to where they've come from. So, but I think on the flip side of that, I also talk about one of the things that I try to do in the book, Octavius, because there's such a polarized debate, is I try to maintain a very nuanced perspective. And maybe you've picked up on this having read parts of the book, is I try to present all sides of the spectrum, all sides of the debate. So I talk about, yes, there has been corrupt forms of post-war profiteering by Liberians who've come from abroad, but Liberians who've come from abroad have also been really involved in public sector productivity. Many of them have set up businesses. Many of them have, been the heads of NGOs, have been involved in humanitarian work. And so we have to think about the broad spectrum of contributions by those who come from abroad or by those who actually live abroad and have settled abroad.
And what do you think about the idea that if you come from, say, the United States to go and work in Liberia, there should be some kind of a legal framework between the government of the United States and the government of Liberia, that should you steal our money, we come after you regardless of where you are?
Yes, and Liberia and the United States have an extradition treaty. But as is the case in many of our laws, we don't implement anything. So Liberia has signed extradition treaties for this very reason, so that people who come from abroad, whether they have other passports or not, they can't evade the law and run away. That there has to be some sort of consequences, that impunity does not reign supreme. So I think that it's a compelling case, and it's more compelling case now than ever before. But we do have these extradition treaties, and I would argue that we need to sign more extradition treaties, and beyond just signing the treaties and having them on our regulations, implementing them. That would create, and this is something that I argue in the book, that would create a sense of lessening the apprehension of those who live in the country about what happens if a would-be dual citizen evades Liberian laws and then decides to just pack up and leave. Are there any sort of legal frameworks that could get that person back, so that they do have to face the full weight of the law in the country?
This year, 2022, we are observing the year of the diaspora. And there's a cynic in me coming out now, 200 years since our brothers and sisters returned from the United States to Liberia in 1822. Do you think this played a role in how fast we were able to get the dual citizenship bill through the House and the Senate? I mean, you cannot refuse dual citizenship to people who, in the recent past, 40, 50 years, want to come back to Liberia and then celebrate a 200-year return.
I would be wary about saying that there's a correlation between the celebration of the year of return and the fact that the House of Representatives has now passed a dual citizenship bill. Now, mind you, there was a dual citizenship bill that was introduced in the Senate in 2008. And although it lingered in legislative limbo for a very long time, it was never passed even during the 53rd or the 54th legislature as a result of this sort of contestation. But dual citizenship has been in the making in Liberia for over 20 years. I don't think that the 2022 celebration of the bicentennial of those who came back from the United States has been the linchpin in terms of pushing this bill forward and enabling it to get through the House of Representatives. It may have been a sort of symbolic, a symbolic way of saying, well, we're in 2022. You can't deny citizenship of those who've left, for many of whom left during the course of the war. But I don't think that it's the thing that tipped the scales in favor of dual citizenship in the House. I think there's been a lot of lobbying on behalf of those who lived abroad. I think a lot of organizations like ULAW and European Federation of Liberian Associations, the Liberian Community Association in Washington, D.C., have done the heavy lifting for a long period of time, and they've been pushing for this bill for a long period of time. So I think symbolically, the year of return is sort of like a gentle nudge to say that we've been fighting this for so long that it's time for you to acknowledge the fact that Liberians abroad play an important political, economic, and social role in terms of socioeconomic transformation in the country. I was going to say that in terms of the year of return, I think we have to be very careful about how we frame this. Because in the same way that the return or the repatriation of Liberians from the United States and the Congo River Basin as well as Caribbean only featured the experiences and the exploits of those who'd come from abroad, I think to a certain extent the year of return could do something similar in a detrimental way by not featuring the experiences and the exploits of those who didn't come from abroad. So I think we have to be very careful about how we frame it such that the vast majority of people in Liberia do not feel slighted in any way, shape, or form. Yes, this should not be the year of the diaspora. It should be the year of the encounter. I would say that we need to change the framing in that respect, because when those who came from abroad, they didn't just come to this sort of barren tabula rasa land where nothing existed. There were people who were thriving. There were, these existing ethno-linguistic groups who existed in the hinterland as well as on the coast, in the same way that those who are coming back for the year of return are meeting or encountering those who never had any sort of experience of being abroad. So I would say that we need to think about it as a year of the encounter or the year of the re-encounter. If we're being sensitive to the varied experiences of Liberians, both abroad as well as those in the country. And given our history of divisiveness, given our history of disunity, we need to think about how does this year of return promote unity? And one of the ways of doing that is to reframe it.
A very important point. But recently you addressed the House of Representatives and senators in Liberia about your book, of course. How did that go? How was the reception?
I mean, it's interesting because I spoke to the House of Representatives when I was in Liberia conducting research for this new book, Africa's Negro Republics. So this would have been early August 2021. And I only spoke to the leadership of the House. So Beaufort Chambers invited me to have a conversation with the leadership of the House. So effectively the heads of different committees of the House. And there was quite a bit of pushback against the idea of what I call advancing the aspirations of Liberians abroad, as well as addressing the anxieties of those at home. So what I've argued is that the dual citizenship bill has to balance the two. So what are the concerns of those in the country, and what are the aspirations of those abroad who want to be able to keep their Liberian citizenship and then have another citizenship? I think many of the House members, the leadership of the House, felt as if addressing the anxieties of those in the country was sort of a moot issue, that it was really about advancing the aspirations of Liberians abroad. In the Senate, it was a bit different because I did present at the end of the year when they had already been presented by this House bill that was passed, right? So they had something very concrete to work with in terms of whether they concur with the House or whether they reject the House bill altogether. And so in my presentation, I talked about the importance of this balance, but I didn't really have a chance to converse with the Senate because I did my presentation for about 25 minutes, and then they thanked me and they said, we will definitely think about your policy recommendations and your major findings in our deliberations. But given the agenda for the plenary on that day, there wasn't much back and forth in terms of the engagement. But what I will say is I did have a post-presentation meeting with Senator Albert Tubechie, and he notified me that many members of the Senate were in favor of my policy recommendations, were in favor of my major findings, and that they would seriously take the 2-page briefing that I gave them into consideration when they are deliberating on the House bill, whether to concur, whether to reject, or maybe to send back the House bill with some revisions. So the jury's still out. We will see in terms of what the Senate decides on this House bill. But I think some of the recommendations that I made are important enough for consideration, or important enough to insert in the House bill, which I believe is a really important progressive bill. It's more progressive than all of the bills that have been proffered between 2008 and now. But I think that there's some essential revisions that need to be inserted in order to, again, address the anxieties, what I believe are legitimate anxieties and fears of those who live in the country.
Robtel Neajai Pailey, her latest book, Development, Dual Citizenship, and Its Discontents in Africa. Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure having you today.
It's been a pleasure being on your show. Thank you very much for the invitation, Octavius.